You may notice we're behind schedule a little bit, but that's okay. We have discussion groups going on later in the morning, so we thought it was better to continue the discussion. So thanks for all your questions. I and Brett after me are going to set up the morning and afternoon discussions where we're really going to go into breakout groups and start formulating our inputs to the decadal survey process. And so I want to do that by just putting a little more concrete feel on what happened in the last decadal survey and how it was structured. Of course, like all good advice, past success does not guarantee future performance. This is not what the decadal survey is going to be. There will be changes. But for those of you who may not be as familiar with it, this is just a way to go through it so that you get a feel for what we did. Is this the clicker? What is going on? It doesn't pick up. Oh, okay, it's a like sticky pad here. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, you heard all of this, so I'm going to skip through it. This is the current decadal. The current decadal is called Visions and Voyages, so you'll hear sometimes it calls the Planetary Decadal, sometimes you'll hear it called Visions and Voyages. That's this document here. If you haven't read it, you really probably should go read it, but you probably, or you may not have read it before you came. So the way this was structured, Steve Squires formerly from Cornell was the chair, and the steering committee, there was a steering committee and then there were 5 subpanels. The subpanels were terrestrial planets. That included the moon. The moon didn't have its own. It was among the terrestrial planets. The giant planets, small bodies, Mars, and satellites. So that was the structure of the last decadal. The vice chair from each of those subpanels sat on the steering committee, but then there were also additional sort of non-affiliated people on the steering committee to give it that broader view. The community members gave input via white papers, and also all the ag groups came in and gave presentations on their priorities. I expect that will be similar, those last 2 bullets, right? We'll have white papers, we'll have presentations from the analysis groups. I presume that's going to be pretty similar. The structure, as Lori has said, is not set in stone yet. You heard this a million times, but I'll just repeat it. The goal of the decadal survey is to seek out the community's views. For the last decadal survey, there were more than a dozen town hall meetings. So if you miss one, that's okay, go to the next one. So there was a real concerted effort, and I expect the next one will be similar, to seek out those community views. And so not just with your role as a lunar scientist coming up through LEAG, but maybe you're an early career scientist and you want to bubble that up. Maybe you have a foot on another planet like Mars or the outer planets and you want to bubble those up as well. So there is room for everyone to get your inputs in and feel heard. Last time there were 199 white papers. You heard Lori say that they took that very seriously and all the subpanels read all the papers. That is true. The open sessions of the meetings were webcast, and the draft report was reviewed by 18 people. So it is a pretty broad community effort. This was the timeline and the process from the last one. Again, not necessarily the same, but just to give you an idea, there's multiple steering group meetings and conference calls. These panels meet on their own as well. But I want to just point out the dates. The first steering group meeting was in July of 2009, and the last one was in August of 2010. So this is a year-long process, approximately. The white papers that we need to put in go in the beginning of the process so that there is time for them to get read and discussed and to get additional concept studies going. So there's room throughout this whole process to get your ideas bubbled up, and it's not something that's taken lightly. I want to go through the current recommendations that we're working under right now and that NASA is using to build their program, just to give you a feel for some of the things that are in bounds for us to consider as we go forward. It's not just missions. So the main recommendations of the current planetary decadal, and this at the bottom just says they all have to fit in the budget, were that RNA be started at the level it was in 2010 or 2012, and then be increased 5% every year above that level, and then above inflation. So include inflation and then 5% above that. And that 6 to 8% of the budget should be invested in technology development. That's the base of the pyramid, according to this decadal survey. They wanted to make sure that that got preserved so that if you get cut, you don't cut down to this base level. After that, discovery missions should be flown every 2 years if possible. After that, 2 new frontiers missions in this decade. After that, Mars sample return, and then if you still have the money, Europa mission. And after that, there are additional flagships as well with priorities on those. So these are the things that are sort of within bounds for white papers, for recommendations from the analysis groups, for you to consider. We talk a lot about missions and white papers about missions, but there's a lot of other things that go into our program. So I want to make sure to draw your attention to these things. There were science themes that came out, even though it was body-centric. There were cross-cutting science themes that were developed. This is sort of akin to our big picture questions. And the report expands on those themes and gives really good science background. So there's a really meaty science document associated with the decadal survey. So those are the places where maybe you're going to go to justify your RNA proposal. Maybe they're the places where you're going to go to pick up on something for your discovery proposal. So even though those things aren't prioritized, this is a really interesting science document. So get your science themes in, get things that are interesting science that you want the decadal to consider and that you want prioritized in NASA's budgets. And that feeds into the RNA recommendations. So the midterm assessment of the last decadal showed that, yes, NASA is meeting this goal of increasing their RNA expenditures of 5% above inflation every year. So that was a really important recommendation that serves everyone. So don't just be thinking about missions, think about your science, RNA, the balance of RNA, things that you want to see get done. That's a really in-bounds decadal survey white paper. Technology development was the next level. How much should we be spending on enabling technology for maybe missions we want to fly next decade, or maybe laboratory investments that we want to make that are going to get more out of samples that we have? Any kind of technology development that we want to be doing, that's also within bounds. So if you have things that you're pursuing or you think need to be pursued, the midterm assessment found that NASA is following the recommendations of the last decadal on investing in new technologies. So this is a really effective thing for the decadal to write. So I expect this is something that we might see again, so please bubble up your ideas there. Mission studies, Lori and Colleen already went over these. So I'm not going to belabor it, but the way that the last decadal structured this was to first say fund your ongoing and approved missions, ones that are already in development, ones that have already been selected. That's where your mission, your money priority goes, is to continuing to develop those missions. Discovery program was next, to have a cadence of discovery missions. They wanted the AO to come out every 2 years. That hasn't turned out to be maybe sustainable for the community to try to spin up writing a discovery proposal every 2 years. So I think Lori has said previously she'd like this to come out in AO every 4 years and maybe pick 2. So that tries to get you on the cadence of a 24-month mission schedule without having to overburden the community every 2 years. Is that a fair statement? Yeah, okay. So that is sort of orange just because it didn't turn out that way, but there's good reasons. Just to note, no discovery mission is prioritized in the decadal survey. There's not even a list of potential discovery missions. That is totally up to the community. But like I said before, you need to hang your mission concept on some good science. So we want that science to be in the decadal. So when you're thinking about your discovery mission ideas and you want to propose those to the decadal, what you're really trying to do is propose that science. Get that science in there so that you can propose against it in your discovery mission. The New Frontiers had a couple recommendations as well, change the cost cap, which was done. And as Kurt alluded to, the decadal really wanted to see 2 selections in this decade, and we may just squeak in there with the AO. So this didn't quite make it, but I think the midterm sort of assessed that and said, well, at least they're really trying. So, and yeah, several people have referred to this already. The decadal survey down selected through a community-driven process, prioritized missions that could fit into this cost cap with a strategic view to what was most important science across the solar system. There probably needs to be a way to assess those periodically as new science comes up. We've done that twice now. There was an update to the first decadal survey, a midterm report that added targets, and there was an addition to this one as well. I think that both of those were variably successful. They've caused some angst in the community, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. If you have ideas on that, of course, send them to Kurt, as he said, but I think that's also fair game for feeding into the decadal process, which is if the decadal survey decides to make a strategic selection of New Frontiers missions, how are they going to update that? This lasts for the whole decade. How are you going to respond to new discoveries? I think if you've got a good idea about that, write a white paper. I think that would be really well considered. Even though the decadal survey made a list of New Frontiers missions, they declined to put priorities on them. So these are just all equal priority, and your creativity and your mission cost and risk and implementation and all of those things are really what make them stand out. And then flagship missions. So flagship missions are large strategic directed missions. Write a white paper about those too. That's awesome. But this isn't going back to being a PI-led competition. This is something that you suggest to NASA that they should do as a strategic priority, and then NASA can take that under consideration. And those were prioritized in the last decadal survey, starting with what was called MAC-C, or Astrobiology Explorer, which is now Mars 2020. So they implemented that. And then the recommendation was, if there's enough money, go for a Europa orbiter, and that de-scoped from the original concept, which was $4.5 billion, and that turned into Europa Clipper. These are the additional ones that they recommended, but there hasn't been enough money to implement additional flagship missions. So the green means that the midterm review assessed that and found that to be compliant. This was brought up a couple times already, and it's going to keep coming up in this community. It's really important to this community, the way that we serve both science and exploration, and the way that lunar science really does both. Science enables exploration, exploration enables science. It's really near and dear to our hearts. It's really hard for a lot of us to compartmentalize and say, no, we're only going to look at what SMD can do. Now, for the decadal survey, I will say that is the most important thing. We really need to stick to what Planetary Science Division is doing in SMD and get our science advocated. But we can't ignore this. The last decadal survey was asked to look at this. They had sort of an ad hoc panel, write a couple pages about it, and it wasn't sufficient. I think they did the best with what they could, but I think if we really want to dig into this, that's maybe something that you can write a white paper about and say, maybe we should have a better panel, or maybe we should have more focused expertise instead of it being just chosen from people who were interested, who were on the decadal. But there are crossovers that have enabled really good science to come out, and pointing to some of these can be really helpful, and in fact probably led to broadening out the NLSI into Survey. Okay, so things that are fair game for today, as you're going to discuss, and Brett's going to give you some logistics on the discussion, but things that are within bounds for today. RNA, what's the appropriate level of RNA? How should it be prioritized? What's your science? What are the science goals? What are the enabling technologies for future research, missions, instruments, laboratories, I would say? How should investments be made? What missions will make the most fundamental breakthroughs in our understanding of the solar system? So remember that we're not just going in and looking at the missions for lunar. We're going in against, again, I shouldn't say that in that way. We're going in with the whole community. We're trying to bring the whole solar system community to a greater understanding of where we came from and where we're going. So when we're doing these cross-cutting themes that we're going to talk about today, we're really trying to say, how is our research going to enable other breakthroughs to be made across the solar system? So how can we broaden out our lunar research and make it relevant to the solar system? How can we make partnerships within NASA, for example, in HEO and STMD, partner with these agency programs that are going on? How can we leverage international partnerships? How can we work with our international partners to get more science accomplished? And workforce planning is something that Astro 2020 is really taking the lead on. We have several people in the room who have been working with them. But how can we create an inclusive and equitable workforce that harnesses the strengths of everyone in American society? This is a really important issue going forward. There's a whole category of white papers that are planning to address some of these things. So inputs received via white papers and LEAG presentations. So let's work out our priorities. Thanks. Come on up, Brett.
Okay, we can probably combine questions for Barb and I together after we kind of go through what our plan is for today. Oh, this is sticky. Bring my slides up if we have those now. So one of the things that I wanted to go over today is kind of the inputs that LEAG has given, as well as what we're going to be doing today, what our goals are for today. So we solicited community input at a survey town hall in July, and as well as via the Lunar Listserv to this exercise that Lori Glaze ran in terms of looking at what are the big picture questions that we could organize the decadal survey around. And these were the questions that LEAG submitted after feedback through those two channels. And those are the kind of topics generally that we'll be organizing around today. How do solar systems form and evolve over time, and when did major solar system events happen? How do planetary interiors differentiate and evolve through time, and how are interior processes expressed through surface-atmosphere interactions? What processes shape planetary surfaces, and how do those surfaces record solar system history? How do worlds become habitable, and how is habitability sustained over time? Why are the climates of planetary bodies so diverse, and how did they evolve over time? And is there life elsewhere in the solar system? There was one additional question that we submitted, which kind of crosses into issues that are not just related to planetary science division. So what are the resources and hazards of the solar system for human exploration? We looked at this question as something that could kind of be relevant to not just the moon, but to small bodies, Jovian system, Mars, and look at the field of study that includes economic geology, potential hazards like radiation, to human exploration. And we've heard that planetary defense is likely to be included in the next decadal survey. And in kind of a similar way, planetary science is really well poised to address this issue in particular. And this is something we just want to make sure doesn't fall through the cracks, because it does straddle this kind of boundary between divisions. Issues like that can, fall into gaps there, because currently, if you have a mission proposal that, or a science proposal that addresses this in a science way, any kind of resource or hazard is just a bonus science that you don't necessarily get credit for. So we think it is worth it, considering this question in the next decadal. One thing that did also come up today is these kinds of new implementation opportunities, commercial entities, public-private partnerships, philanthropic spaceflight, and how these fit into the decadal survey process. What our finding on this was that these aren't necessarily new things that the decadal should be considering, but they are new modes of acquisition and new ways of implementing our science priorities. So the view is that the decadal provides the science priorities, and then NASA can implement them in any way that they find appropriate, including RNA competed and directed missions, partnerships with other divisions, and commercial models of delivering data or instruments. As Barb already alluded to, this could be something that the Decadal spends a chapter highlighting on how these science priorities that we are all going to discuss today and come up with could be mapped to some of these emerging opportunities. So what are our goals as the Lunar Exploration Analysis Group, the Lunar Science and Exploration Community, for the next decadal survey? Our number one overarching goal is to make sure that our science priorities are captured within the next decadal survey. And the way that we do that is that we need to effectively convey these priorities to the decadal panel via white papers in a large way and through other inputs into the decadal process. So also covered by Barb, but this really enables compelling proposals. This is not just about the big missions, but it is also what we can do to show that our proposals are compelling. Everything from our smaller ROSES proposals to discovery proposals can really highlight the importance, significance, timeliness of what we want to do when you can point to priorities as defined by the decadal survey. We also need to ensure that our highest priority lunar science can be addressed in the New Frontiers program or via flagship missions, as appropriate. And especially when, this is true for all of them, but especially when we get to priorities that rise to the New Frontiers or the flagship class, we have to focus on communicating our priorities in ways that the broader planetary science community finds compelling. And so that is part of our goal for today. That is why we are structuring the breakout groups in these big picture questions. And our goals for today are to identify and prioritize the science goals and missions for the next decade, to start generating a list of white papers and potential authors, and then to create a framework and identify 2 representatives for each of these breakout groups that will contribute to the LEAG Science Goals document. We are doing all of this work, so we might as well write it all up into a science goals document that we can carry forward and evolve. So I've already kind of outlined the big picture questions that we're going to talk about, and we did ask for volunteers, for people who could help organize this process, and there were many, many volunteers, which is fantastic, and we want to make sure that those volunteers, we have selected a few people to co-chair the discussion today and to help document it. But there are this process is going to continue well beyond today. So we want to make sure that those volunteers still feel like they have a way to participate in this process. So I think one of the logistical questions we need to figure out too is where the groups are going to go. We have 3 groups that are going to kind of fill the space in here, probably the smaller ones, and then 2 breakout group rooms that hold 75 people each. So I'm not sure the best way to do that, if we want to like raise hands of where you feel like your primary affiliation is today. Of course, you can move around. Yeah, so the groups are the solar systems. How did they form and evolve? We've listed some potential topics here. They are not meant to be exclusive or entirely inclusive. These are just to give you a general idea of the types of things that your group can cover. How the moon can inform solar system dynamics, formation of the moon, giant impact, bombardment chronology, how the observation of the moon can inform our understanding of extrasolar systems. The planetary formation, or really kind of planetary interiors, looking at lunar magma ocean and differentiation, geophysical studies of the interior, paleomagnetism, volcanism and plutonism, and outgassing. planetary geology, looking at geology and geomorphology, impact processes, regolith development, lunar volatiles, solar wind plasma interactions, and habitability. There was some confusion over this one, but this is really questions of the moon, how it can contribute to the understanding of how worlds become habitable. Organic and volatile delivery to the Earth-Moon system, volatile formation and transport, volatile history of the Earth-Moon system that could be preserved on the moon, and solar wind and plasma interactions. And then group E, looking at the resources and hazards, locating and understanding resources on the moon, small bodies, Mars, identification of potential hazards such as radiation, seismicity. This is something that Carly Peters mentioned and is a good way to think in terms of how we can communicate our science priorities in ways that are compelling to the full planetary science community, and think of the biggest picture, the big picture of these questions. How does understanding evolution and character of our home, the Earth-Moon system, expand science horizons and enable us to plan for and protect an extended future? If you want to take what you are doing in your group and just kind of consider how it maps to these biggest picture, as well as how you can start considering how your group's priorities trace across and connect with the other groups as well. The instructions that we circulated earlier, and hopefully many of you have seen, that we are going to discuss these issues, and we have a template that we've sent out just to kind of aid in the discussion and the presentations that we'll do from the breakout groups at the end of the day. And those will be 10-minute presentations to present, but we'll have postings of the kind of larger slides and summaries after this as well. And then in terms of the schedule, we are a bit behind schedule this morning, but feel free to kind of schedule your group as you see fit. We're supposed to start at 10:30, the breakout discussions, and then go until 3 p.m. with lunch in there at some point. Feel free to pause for lunch whenever is natural, or work through lunch if, science is all you need for sustenance. There are 3 main points to the instructions for the discussions today. The first is really the most important: identify outstanding lunar science goals that feed into the big picture questions. We have a whole host of documents that have already been discussed today, and how these, that we're not starting from scratch here. We have the Lunar Exploration Roadmap that does a fantastic job of outlining a lot of this already. The 2007 NRC report, The Scientific Context for Exploration of the Moon. And then an update to that, the Advancing Science of the Moon document that is really the current statement of LEAG community goals, though it was not reprioritized from the 2007 report. But so we can start from there and trace back to those goals, as well as, of course, identifying any new areas that weren't captured in any of these documents. We want to identify and start to work toward prioritizing areas of progress that should be accomplished in the next decade. And this includes areas in RNA and technology, investments that will be needed. And then this is an important part too, identifying 2 people. They don't need to be people who have already signed up to help today, but 2 people who can help write all of this up into a LEAG Science Goals document. We want also to work on identifying missions that would address the most important science goals in the next decade. So these include the smaller missions, though those don't need to be prioritized. But we'd also like you to choose and present this afternoon up to 2 larger New Frontiers or flagship class missions that could accomplish your group's most important science goals. So what are the science goals that it would address? What other planetary science goals? How does it link to the other big picture questions? And importantly, why is the moon the best place to accomplish this science? And why do we need to do it in this next decade? And then in order to get ready for that, what kind of investments are needed? And finally, work toward creating a list of potential white papers and authors that would address the range and importance of your group's science goals. So the missions you've discussed, the science priorities you've discussed. These will be posted on the LPI website. We'll probably start a Google Doc now just to get organized and make sure that authors and co-authors with similar interests can find each other. So that is all of the instructions that I had for now. Are there questions on this process? And then we can start looking at how to divide and conquer.
Pam Clark, JPL. I'd just like to comment that all new discoveries are preceded by major advances in technology. So if we're talking about implementation style, people should be aware that the CubeSat paradigm doesn't necessarily mean it's a little cube, but the CubeSat paradigm is a very disruptive technology and allows the possibility for the first time of doing distributed measurements, which can have a tremendous impact on getting understanding global systems and how and what we find out and what our, basically what future exploration is like. So, although I think somewhere in the decadal survey, ultimately we need to address how we want to make sure that we allow opportunities for some of the newer approaches and newer technologies that didn't exist 10 years ago or 20 years ago when the other surveys were written.
Yes, definitely. If we can try and start mapping our science priorities to different opportunities, that's definitely important.
Ben Greenhagen, APL. So as was talked about this morning, we have these 3 large planetary mission concept studies, which are going to be studied. In terms of the breakouts, is that something that we should try to highlight and increase the priority of those missions to addressing these science questions, or should we say those are already paid for? Let's try to find new ones for the decadal survey to support.
I think neither. We should be focusing on our science priorities. I think some of those will naturally map to some of the planetary mission concept studies that were already selected, and some won't, and those will lead to white papers advocating for other concept studies, I would think. Okay. Seeing no other questions, now is the hard part of actually breaking up into these groups. We have a feeling that maybe I should go back to those. Well, we can't.
So you don't have to exclusively go to the group, but can we just get an indication of the group you're most likely to attend first, so we can just break out into reasonable rooms?
Yeah, so group A, solar systems,
Raise
show
your
of hands.
Okay, all right. Okay, you guys are gonna go back by the lunar lander.
Group B, planetary formation, interiors.
Right on. How about
Okay.
probably a room up here?
Okay.
Yeah, probably over here by the door.
Planetary geology, group C.
Let's put you in a breakout room. Which are our breakout rooms?
They're kind of, we walked past, I don't know what they're.
There's one to the left of the registration desk and one to the right of the registration desk if you're facing the registration desk.
Do you want to be left or right?
Right.
Left. How about your left? You're the left breakout room.
Habitability.
Habitability, folks, come on up to this corner.
And resources and hazards.
You will be in the right breakout room.
There we go. Okay.
And your chairs should all have the template that we're working to. If any of the chairs don't have the template or need the instructions, let us know.
Yeah, and the template is really meant to guide discussion, but just make sure that your group should feel comfortable adjusting as necessary.
Okay, so we're going to reconvene in this room at 3 p.m. to hear the outbriefs. So you probably want to wrap up your discussions by 2:30, 2:45, get them in a format, and then we'll outbrief here at 3.
All right.